They found him alone. The smell of oil still hung in the air. The machines were still humming, as if they hadn't realized their master was gone. A single lamp burned over a desk cluttered with sketches, wires, and half-built circuitry. And beneath it, a note written in a hand too steady to belong to despair. They won't understand until it works. For months, people said the same thing, that it was suicide, that his obsession had consumed him. But years later, when his invention began saving lives in silence, the world gave him a new title. They called him genius. His name was James Harrington. Born 1914, Youngstown, Ohio, a city built from the hum of steel and the sigh of tired men. He was the kind of engineer who never appeared in photographs, the kind whose brilliance was measured not in fame, but in function. He wasn't brilliant in the cinematic sense. He was methodical, patient, deliberate, a man who loved machines because they made sense when people didn't. After the Second World War, when the factories that had built bombers now built refrigerators, Harrington joined a small manufacturing firm designing industrial control systems. The war was over, but his generation had learned something permanent from it. Machines could fail in ways that humans could not predict. And when they did, the cost was measured in bodies. James couldn't stop thinking about that. He believed machines could learn to protect the people who built them. He believed that prevention was a form of mercy, and mercy, in his hands, became mathematics. It began with a single tragedy. A Lockheed Constellation, Flight 567, crashed over the Pennsylvania hills, a frozen hydraulic valve, 62 dead. The newspapers blamed the pilot. The company blamed the weather. But Harrington read the accident report and saw something else. A series of tiny fluctuations in temperature and pressure recorded minutes before failure, a warning no one had heard. He filled a notebook with numbers, charting the rise and fall of vibration frequencies, pressure ratios, stress curves. To everyone else, it looked like chaos. To him, it looked like language. The machines, he thought, were trying to speak. They just needed someone to listen. He called his idea the Sentinel, a mechanical guardian, a system that could sense when a machine was approaching failure and correct it before the human hand could react. It wasn't electronic, not yet. This was 1948, a world of relays, vacuum tubes, and copper nerves. So he built it with what he had: switches, gears, pressure regulators, and a memory made of moving parts. On a wooden test stand in his workshop, he simulated hydraulic pressure from an aircraft's control system. He introduced a fault, a frozen valve, a burst line, a vibration surge. The Sentinel reacted instantly. It vented pressure, redirected flow, balanced the system. The gauge needles stopped trembling. For the first time, a machine had corrected itself. He brought it to his employers. He was proud, exhausted, certain they would see what he saw. They didn't. Machines don't think, his supervisor said, and if they do, they'll take your job. The words hit him harder than any insult. He tried again, wrote papers, filed proposals, mailed designs to every aviation company he could find. Nothing. One reply from a defense contractor read, "Your concept is intriguing but unnecessary. Human oversight remains the best safeguard." He knew they were wrong, because the crash reports kept coming, because machines kept failing, and because humans were always too late. The laughter began to sound like a countdown. By 1950, Harrington had stopped asking for permission. He mortgaged his house, sold his car, and moved his workshop into a rented garage. He lived on canned beans and cigarettes, sleeping beside the warm hum of the vacuum tubes that were now his only companions. He wrote to no one. He answered to nothing but the ticking of his instruments. He built a second prototype, smaller, faster, capable of monitoring multiple systems at once. He replaced relays with new transistor components just beginning to appear on the market. He even designed a fail-safe, a secondary circuit that could override human error automatically. March 1952. The coldest night of the year in Ohio, wind howled against the corrugated walls of Harrington's workshop, but inside the air was still, too still. He had been awake for 37 hours, coffee gone cold, blueprints scattered like fallen leaves across the floor. And in the center of it all, a machine that looked less like an invention and more like an altar, a gyroscopic test rig, Metal arms spinning, pistons pumping, circuits glowing orange in the dim light. At its heart, his latest Sentinel, wired to sense motion and stress the way nerves sense pain. He tightened a bolt, flipped the switch, and for the first time, the rig didn't shake. It moved smoothly, adjusting, compensating, balancing itself against chaos. Then at 2:11 a.m., but something happened. The system detected an imbalance before it existed. The sensor lights blinked a fraction too early. The vibration never came. It was as if the machine had predicted the fault. He stared at the gauges. His pen fell from his hand. For a long time, the only sound was the steady hum of stability, the machine thinking without him. He whispered, "It worked." The next morning, the landlord found smoke pouring from the workshop. Neighbors called the fire department. By the time help arrived, the building was gone, a pile of blackened metal and half-melted copper. They found Harrington unconscious, his hands burned, his clothes soaked in oil and blood. Beside him, a twisted gyroscope still faintly glowing, as if the fire had failed to kill it. He lived for 2 days. In the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, he repeated the same phrase to a nurse who didn't understand what it meant. It worked. It worked. Then silence. The official report called it an accident. His company called it suicide. The newspapers didn't call it anything at all. A file marked automatic correction apparatus arrived at the U.S. Patent Office 3 weeks later. It was stamped, dated, and forgotten. No one ever claimed the rights. For years, his name existed only as a line of ink on an abandoned application. The blueprints were boxed, the workshop demolished, his grave unmarked. But inside one of the crates, stored deep in a federal repository in Dayton, among other post-war curiosities, Harrington's prototype still existed. The label on its crate read simply, Experimental Stabilization Unit, status unverified. For nearly a decade, it gathered dust in silence, until someone finally opened it. 1956. Douglas Aviation, California. A young systems engineer named Alan Thorne was studying vibration control in jet engines. He was brilliant, underpaid, and addicted to curiosity, much like Harrington before him. While sifting through declassified technical archives, he came across the forgotten patent. Its diagrams were strange, anachronistic, filled with hand-drawn circuits that behaved like logic gates, and equations that described preemptive feedback, a phrase no one had used before. He thought it was impossible. Then he built one. It worked. The device stabilized an experimental engine automatically, compensating for thrust imbalance without pilot input. It was mechanical instinct, the first hint of automation born from empathy, not efficiency. Thorne was stunned. He called his design supervisor. They watched the test together. When it ended, the older man said quietly, "Find out who built this first." Thorne never did, but history was already beginning to remember. Douglas filed a new patent, Automatic Stability Augmentation System. They called it modern, but it was the same heartbeat, refined, miniaturized, reborn. Within a few years, every new jetliner used the technology. Every pilot flying through turbulence felt the invisible hand of Harrington's idea, correcting, balancing, saving. And as aviation embraced it, other industries followed. Firefighting engines, nuclear safety valves, rocket guidance systems. Everywhere machines protected human life, a fragment of the Sentinel lived on, an echo of a man who had died building compassion into metal. In 1964, an Air Force test pilot flying through severe turbulence noted that the stabilizer seemed to move before I did. He joked that it was reading his mind. He didn't know it was reading the air. He didn't know that the system correcting his aircraft had been born in a burned-down Ohio garage 12 years earlier. That flight ended safely. So did thousands after it. So did millions. And every time a ghost adjusted the wings, the name Sentinel never appeared again. Not in manuals, not in patents, not in company records, but its spirit did. By the 1960s, aviation had entered its golden age. Airliners cut through the sky like silver threads. Passengers crossed oceans before breakfast, and buried deep in their circuitry, hidden among relays and gyroscopes, lived the heartbeat of one man's obsession. Every time a pilot fought turbulence, every time a plane leveled itself in midair without human touch, James Harrington's ghost reached out, steadying the wings. The machine had survived him. It had inherited his purpose. and in doing so it had made him immortal. Industry moved forward faster than anyone could imagine. Factories once powered by men now pulsed with the rhythm of machines. Engines learned to regulate themselves. Ships balanced their own ballast. Spacecraft corrected their trajectories mid-flight, automatically. The word automation became sacred, but few remembered where it had started. Not in corporate boardrooms, not in laboratories funded by nations, but in the quiet desperation of a man who refused to accept the phrase human error. When historians later traced the origins of autonomous safety systems, they always arrived at the same point of divergence, a patent number with no inventor assigned. The Sentinel had vanished from record, but its fingerprints covered the entire technological landscape of the modern world. In 1972, a journalist named Clara Owens, a writer for an engineering journal called The Practical Mechanic, began digging through old patent archives for a story on early analog computers. She came across an application marked Filed, 1952, applicant deceased. The title stopped her cold, Automatic Mechanical Correction Apparatus. The description read like a time capsule. Terms such as predictive fault compensation and self-correcting architecture, language that didn't even exist when it was written. She tracked the address listed on the form to Youngstown, Ohio. The building was gone. In its place stood a car lot. No one there had ever heard the name James Harrington. So she went to the county archive, and there, among yellowed records, she found the police report from 1952, the burned workshop, the note on the desk, the final words. They won't understand until it works. She published an article titled The Man Who Taught Machines to Care. It caused a quiet storm. Aviation companies began to dig into their own archives. Douglas, Lockheed, Boeing, all discovered fragments, schematics, notes, letters, pieces of circuitry built directly from Harrington's design. It was undeniable. He had invented the foundation of modern stabilization systems. He had been erased, not out of malice, but out of neglect. His legacy had been absorbed by progress itself. And so, 2 decades after his death, the engineering community finally said his name again. A small plaque was placed in the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum beside an early autopilot module. The inscription read, "In memory of James Harrington, 1914-1952. His work made flight safer for us all. No fanfare, no parade, just acknowledgement, the quiet apology of history." The Sentinel's influence stretched beyond flight. In 1969, NASA engineers designing the Apollo lunar module integrated a variant of the same feedback principles. They called it predictive load compensation. It prevented overcorrection during lunar descent. In 1973, power plant designers used the same logic to create automatic pressure regulators for nuclear reactors. The difference between success and meltdown was now measured in milliseconds. Milliseconds his invention could predict. Everywhere systems learned to anticipate instead of react, Harrington's invisible fingerprints were there. He had built not intelligence, but empathy, a mechanical form of foresight. In a rare television interview, one of Douglas Aviation's chief engineers was asked about Harrington's rediscovery. He said, "The man was 40 years ahead of his time. We're still trying to catch up with his way of thinking that machines shouldn't just do, they should notice." The interviewer asked what that meant. The engineer smiled. "It means the difference between reaction and awareness, between response and understanding." He didn't invent automation. He invented conscience. By the 1980s, the world had embraced automation as gospel. Airplanes corrected themselves. Cars adjusted brakes automatically. Factories shut down before danger struck, and behind every system, every mechanism that saved a life was the echo of a man who died trying to make machines care. The Sentinel had done more than protect engines. It had given the modern world its first taste of technological compassion, an instinct born from tragedy, preserved by circuitry. James Harrington was gone, but the world had become his laboratory. By the time the 20th century neared its close, machines had begun to think faster than the men who built them. Commercial airliners could correct course in storms. Power grids could reroute themselves during overload. Automated systems predicted danger and acted before anyone could blink. And yet, beneath the hum of computers and silicon, something older endured, a philosophy born in a smoky Ohio workshop from a man who refused to accept the phrase human error. Every time a plane stabilized itself in turbulence, every time an engine adjusted to save fuel, every time a system noticed before it failed, Harrington was there. He had become the conscience of progress, invisible, omnipresent, undying. In 1991, long after his name had faded from textbooks again, a software engineer at Boeing revisited early stabilization patents. She found one drawing that fascinated her. A looped feedback diagram, annotated with the words anticipate, not react. It became the tagline for her project, a digital evolution of the old analog Sentinel. Her team built it, not with mercury switches and gears, but with algorithms and processors, a digital nervous system for aircraft. They called it the Predictive Autonomy Framework, but in the engineers' break room, they still called it what it really was, Harrington's machine. It saved its first flight in 1993, when a malfunctioning sensor misread altitude data. The system recognized the inconsistency, ignored the error, and corrected the pitch automatically, before the pilots even knew something was wrong. When the plane landed, the crew had no idea what had just saved them, but the engineers did. They left a single note in the maintenance log. It worked. In 2004, at a conference on aerospace automation, a senior systems engineer ended his keynote with a strange confession. We spend billions teaching machines to think. Harrington taught them to care. We just keep refining the lesson. The audience didn't clap right away. They didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew that every safeguard they had designed came from the same quiet principle. Machines should never wait for permission to prevent tragedy. That idea, that courage of anticipation, had become doctrine. It was the moral code of modern engineering, the grave that became a shrine. In 2006, local historians in Youngstown rediscovered Harrington's burial records. His grave was unmarked, a patch of grass between two oaks at the edge of a small cemetery. The local engineering society raised funds for a plaque. It wasn't large, a piece of brushed steel with 3 lines of text. James Harrington, 1914, 1952. He imagined safety. The world followed. The dedication ceremony was small. Rain drizzled over the microphones. Among the crowd were pilots, factory workers, and a handful of students. No cameras, no press. But when the plaque was unveiled, a light breeze passed through the trees, soft, almost mechanical. Some said it sounded like the sigh of an engine spinning down. The oldest man there, a retired flight engineer with hands like worn metal, saluted and said quietly, "We all owe him our next landing." Today, more than 70 years after his death, machines have surpassed even Harrington's dreams. They learn, decide, predict, adapt. They run hospitals, drive vehicles, regulate cities. They perform surgery, predict earthquakes, and manage the chaos of a civilization that can no longer control its own speed. But buried beneath the algorithms, the code still carries his voice, a single conditional that every safety system obeys. If instability detected, correct immediately. That's his fingerprint, still saving lives in every language a machine speaks. Genius rarely dies of old age. It burns, it isolates, it consumes those who see too far ahead to wait for understanding. James Harrington's death was not a failure. It was the ignition. He believed that safety was not a feature. It was a responsibility. That machines should not simply obey orders. They should protect life, even from human mistakes. And that belief reshaped the modern world. If you walk through Youngstown today, you'll find nothing left of his workshop, just a parking lot, smooth, silent, forgetful. But some nights, truck drivers passing by swear they see a faint light where the building once stood, a single lamp burning behind invisible glass. They say if you stop and listen, you can hear the faint hum of old circuits warming up, the whisper of gears turning without hands. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe it's the Sentinel, still waiting for the next imbalance, still ready to correct it before anyone notices. Because that's what progress does. It doesn't die. It endures quietly in every life it saves.